When a female becomes a parent, her entire universe is transformed. Offspring turn into the essence of her being, and her affection for them is limitless. Occasionally, males who might inflict damage fail to comprehend what a mother is willing to do when her kid's well-being is threatened. The city of Racine, Wisconsin. An uncommon call was received by the 911 dispatch. The person on the line was murmuring something unclear. Initially, the operator didn't consider the call to be genuine, suspecting it was a hoax. However, despite the fact that the lady on the other end of the phone was scarcely breathing and her voice faded into nothingness, she managed to communicate crucial details to the dispatcher, desperately wanting to be taken seriously. When officers arrived at the location given by the caller, the residence was empty. Nevertheless, they discovered a sizable blood stain on the living room rug and a vacant gun case. Subsequently, a male reached out to emergency services. He informed them that his spouse, Teri, had vanished, along with their 2 daughters, who had also disappeared without leaving any clues. Let's rewind to 1995. David Larson, a former Marine, was a desirable husband. He worked as an air traffic controller and was a homeowner. However, Teri was drawn to his joyful disposition rather than his possessions and stable career. As the couple got to know each other better, they found they had a lot in common. They both had a strong desire for a family and wished to have kids. In 1996, after a year of courtship, Teri Jandusa and David Larson tied the knot. It appeared that a joyous life together was in store for them. In the following years, the family expanded. They welcomed 2 lovely daughters, Amanda and Holly, born 2 years apart. However, Teri soon realized that the true David was not as gentle and delightful as she had believed. He first struck her during their honeymoon in Hawaii. Stunned and profoundly distressed, Teri demanded an explanation. David declared that she was now his wife and required to follow her husband's orders. At first, the woman regarded it as their first lover's spat, and initially dismissed the incident as insignificant. She stayed in the relationship, hoping she could transform Larson's abrasive personality. Throughout the following years, the man completely dominated his wife and frequently had violent outbursts. David's aggressive nature emerged, and once he slammed his wife's head against the door. Every time he lost control or had a sudden fit of rage, he tried to persuade Teri that it was her fault and she needed to behave better. Then he wouldn't get angry. The woman was genuinely afraid of what he might do and tried her best to keep her husband satisfied because even the slightest triviality could enrage him. David yelled at Teri if the curtains were slightly askew or if the towels weren't folded a certain way. He insisted she keep the door open when taking a shower or using the bathroom. The woman was so afraid of her husband's explosive reactions to trivial accidents, like a broken plate, that she disposed of any incriminating evidence in the neighbor's trash can. Once, David noticed a burnt sausage in the pot and reprimanded his wife for squandering his funds. During uncontrollable fits of rage, terrified Teri frequently sought refuge in the basement, as she had no other place to conceal herself. You see, David had installed locks on the doors between the rooms, and only he possessed the keys. Larson demanded absolute submission from his wife. One day, as usual, Teri was preparing dinner when David arrived home and noticed a package of spaghetti on the table. For some unknown reason, this infuriated him, and he insisted that his wife promptly remove the pasta before it spoiled. Her arguments that dry pasta couldn't vanish so rapidly only fueled his anger further. David declared that she should follow his instructions, not argue. At that instant, Teri was holding their 2-month-old baby, but that didn't deter the furious David, and he angrily shoved his wife. The baby wailed, and once more the woman pondered if she desired such a life for her daughters. It was then that she resolved she would do anything to shield her children from their tyrannical father. Teri pledged to herself that she would leave this relationship, regardless of the cost. The woman endured aggression from her husband, believing deep down that the issue was with her, that she was somehow acting incorrectly. But as soon as she sensed that David might pose a danger to the children, Teri fully realized that he was the problem. Filled with determination to protect her daughters, she packed her belongings while her husband was away, grabbed the children, and found temporary refuge at a domestic violence shelter. Immediately after that, in November 1999, she filed for divorce, but Larson used all available means at his disposal to prolong the process. As a result, their marriage was dissolved only on January 31, 2001. It seemed like the situation had finally been resolved, but for Teri, it turned into another nightmare. The judge granted her and David joint custody of the children, despite the fact that he had insulted and mistreated his wife, and now she had to allow him to see Amanda and Holly. On the steps of the courthouse on the day the divorce was essentially finalized, David leaned towards his ex-wife and, looking into her eyes, spitefully whispered that she would regret what she had done. Teri escaped after many years of aggression and violence, but the danger had not passed. She worried about her girls every time she had to hand them over to their father for the weekends. David's threats constantly echoed in her mind, and it was terrifying to trust him with the children. Larson persisted in verbally and physically assaulting Teri whenever she brought or picked up their daughters. That's when she demanded that they exchange the children in public locations. She had to summon the police twice to depart her ex-husband's residence without any incidents, and eventually, she secured a restraining order against him. Peace of mind only arrived 3 years later when Teri encountered Nick-Nicolai. She discovered in him the support and comfort she had been lacking. The woman started to open up and trust people once more. She and Nick fell in love, and he gave her the care and attention she merited. Soon they became a joyful family, and Nick treated the girls as his own children. In 2003, Nick and Teri got married. It was supposed to be a time of joy and happiness. However, Teri soon discovered that her ex-husband was not prepared to let her go. David told acquaintances that she would regret the day she decided to marry Nick. He believed that in his and God's eyes they were still married, so by remarrying, Teri was going against God's will. He kept mementos from their wedding, including her dress, photo albums, and videos, which he showed to the girls as evidence that their mother did not keep her promises. Unable to control his ex-wife's life any further, Larson devised something dreadful. On January 31, 2004, on the third anniversary of Teri and David's divorce, the woman had no idea that her worst fears would soon materialize. On that day, she intended to go to Larson's residence to pick up her daughters, 6-year-old Amanda and 4-year-old Holly, after their scheduled visit with their father. Over time, despite the restraining order, Teri relaxed as her ex-husband tried to maintain his composure. Nick-Nicolai offered to accompany her, but Teri still feared David's reaction and decided that the presence of her new husband would only complicate matters, so she went alone. Larson had a volatile temper, and she wanted to do everything possible to keep him from exploding in front of the girls. Although she was about to face her tough ex-husband, Teri was in high spirits. Having missed her daughters, she couldn't wait to see them and share important family news. She was sure the girls would be thrilled. It was a beautiful frosty morning. The evening before, she and Nick had learned that Teri was pregnant, so the couple was overjoyed. The enthusiastic mother couldn't wait to tell her daughters that they would have another brother or sister. Exactly at 10 a.m., Teri approached Larson's house and knocked. The man opened the door, and she thought his mood seemed better than usual today. David said the girls were playing hide-and-seek and wanted their mom to find them. Although Teri's intuition told her that something might be wrong on his part, she entered. At that moment, she had a strange feeling that something was off. When Teri turned to Larson in confusion, he reminded her that she had once accused him of violence, although it wasn't true. But now she would fully understand what it means when a husband beats you. Teri didn't even have time to respond before David picked up a nearby baseball bat, and then everything plunged into darkness. When consciousness returned, she found herself lying on the floor in the living room of her ex-husband's house. Her head was unbearably painful, as if it had been hit several times with something heavy. Blood was flowing from her ear, and her body felt paralyzed. Before Teri could try to move and understand what had happened, David wrapped her in duct tape and then began to squeeze her neck with his hands. The first thought that came to her mind was, "Where are the girls?" The woman couldn't give up until she knew they were safe. Teri remembered from a movie how to protect herself when being choked. She turned her head to the side and began to pray. David was losing his grip, frustrated that he couldn't easily dispose of his ex-wife, and he started to lose control. Teri resisted with all her strength, but the blows to her head didn't go unnoticed, and she had lost too much blood. To her horror, she realized that she wouldn't be able to escape even if the opportunity presented itself. Her mind raced. At that time, Larson made unsuccessful attempts to strangle Teri, took her outside, and threw her into a trash bin, which he then closed and loaded onto a truck to take away. He sprinkled snow and ice to cover up the traces. Teri could hear him sealing the container with tape to lock her inside permanently. Then, David dragged the trash bin to the truck and covered it with a tarp to disguise it. Meanwhile, Teri desperately searched for a way out, knowing he might dump her in the woods, shoot her, or try to get rid of her in some other way. Apparently, he refrained from shooting inside the house to avoid attracting the neighbors' attention. But Teri's main concern was not for herself. She worried that if Larson could escape punishment for her death, he might gain sole custody of their daughters. But even more frightening was the possibility that he could harm the girls after she disappeared. Who knows what's going on in the mind of this monster? Teri was trembling from the cold. Her thoughts were disjointed. She couldn't figure out how to flee. The vehicle bounced on the potholes. Presumably, Larson was in a hurry to complete his sinister act. Suddenly, in one moment, the container shook so violently that Teri hit the wall, and it dawned on her. David was so confident that everything would go smoothly for him that he made a huge mistake. He didn't notice that she still had her mobile phone in the pocket of her hoodie. The thawing snow slightly loosened the sticky tape on her body, and Teri managed to reach into her pocket and dial 911 by touch. She could barely utter a few words, but for some reason, the 911 operator was skeptical, thinking it was some kind of prank. The captive had neither the strength nor the time to explain what had happened. She only managed to say that she was on the brink of death and dictate the name and address of her kidnapper. Teri didn't know where her ex-husband was planning to take her, and she couldn't remember how much battery life was left on her phone. She wanted to make another call to her husband, Nick, to inform him of the situation and bid farewell. Unlike the 911 dispatcher, Nick didn't hesitate. He immediately understood what was going on. The man didn't talk for too long to avoid draining his wife's phone battery, as the mobile could be her only tool for rescue. He told her he loved her and said goodbye, wondering if this would be the last time he heard Teri's voice. In a panic, Nick immediately called the police and reported his wife missing. He also reported that David Larson had taken his 2 daughters for the weekend, and now the girls were missing. The police received a lead on 3 missing persons, and now they faced a race against time to quickly find the missing mother and her 2 daughters. They already knew that Teri was being held against her will, but they didn't know where her children had been all this time, or if they were in any danger. It was at that moment that a patrol car was dispatched to David Larson's address. Meanwhile, locked in the trash bin in the bed of her ex-husband's pickup truck, Teri felt that she might pass out at any moment due to blood loss. If Larson drove into the nearest forest, the police might never find her, so she began to push the lid of the bin from the inside to try to escape, but the tape didn't give way. She only managed to stick her hand out, giving her some chance of rescue if anyone noticed her. Teri began to desperately wave her hand, hoping that passing pedestrians or vehicles would notice. But before anyone could see her, movement in the truck bed caught David's attention. He glanced in the rearview mirror and immediately realized what was happening. Pulling over to the side of the road, he climbed out of the cab and into the pickup bed. With all his might, Larson struck the container and threatened to end Teri's life right there if she didn't calm down. Adjusting the tarp, he was about to return to the driver's seat when something unexpected happened. Teri's phone suddenly started ringing, and her heart froze. It was her only chance of rescue. Trying to quickly silence the ringtone or reject the call, the woman futilely fumbled with her frozen fingers. Unfortunately, David heard the ringtone. He tore off the lid of the container and snatched the mobile from the captive's hands. Resealing the trash bin with sticky tape, He got back into the cab and resumed driving. Inside her, Teri still carried a tiny, unborn child, and her 2 daughters, who needed care, were somewhere unknown, with no chance of rescue for herself. At that moment, she couldn't even cry, but her thoughts were interrupted by the wail of police sirens approaching directly toward them. Teri knew they were coming to save her, but to her great dismay, the patrol car zoomed past and the sounds faded into the distance. The police were not looking for the pickup truck at that moment. They were rushing to David Larson's house. Law enforcement officers couldn't even imagine that they had just passed by a woman who had called 911, sealed in a trash bin. The captive felt utterly helpless. In that moment when the sirens quieted down, she, wounded, sat in the filthy container, realizing that she was about to lose everything. Her daughters, Nick, the unborn child, and her seemingly happy life. When the police arrived at the scene, they knocked down the door, but found no one inside. In the living room, officers discovered a sizable bloodstain on the carpet and a vacant gun holster. Neither the girls nor their mother were in the house, and neither was the homeowner. While searching the rooms, the officers noticed that all the walls of the house were adorned with photographs of David and Teri's life together. During the search, they also found women's athletic pants, with remnants of sticky tape wrapped around the ankles. There was a red substance resembling blood on the tape. They interviewed neighbors who said they had seen David towing Teri's car earlier that morning. Detectives understood that they had only a few hours at their disposal, and if the perpetrator hadn't dealt with Teri immediately, he might have headed to another location to finish what he had started. The police weren't going to waste a single second until they found the children and their mother safe and sound. Experts tried to track David and Teri's cell phones. They managed to trace Larson's mobile signal to Milwaukee, about a half-hour's drive from his home, but then the signal disappeared. In addition to other findings, detectives found real estate documents in Milwaukee. There were 3 different addresses, and the police checked each building. Next to one of the properties, the police found Teri Jandusa-Nicolai's car. They thought David had tried to get rid of the car, but might have left clues inside that could indicate the further direction. However, the car was empty, and there was no evidence of the recent presence of the children or their mother. In other properties owned by Larson, the police also found no leads. Time was running out, and the lives of the abducted could be interrupted at any moment. Nick Nicolai, Teri's second husband, was beside himself. He couldn't calm down and berated himself for letting his pregnant wife go to this monster's house. But what worried him even more was the fate of the girls, whom the man had already come to love. At the same time, the police were searching for any leads, questioning relatives and friends. The Amber Alert system for child abductions in the U.S. was activated. Nearly 100 law enforcement officers were exploring various leads in the case. Volunteers, some of whom had never met Teri, spent the day driving around city blocks and inspecting basements of unfinished houses in search of any signs of her presence. But their surprise was immense when David Larson went to his job as an air traffic controller that evening, acting as if nothing had happened. He arrived in the same green pickup truck that the police were looking for, and he was immediately taken in for questioning. The man told the detectives that he was shocked to hear about Teri's disappearance and would do everything in his power to help find her. The investigators played along, allowing him to believe they believed his words. However, as David insisted that his ex-wife didn't show up to take the girls, his lies began to accumulate. Larson claimed he had been at home all morning, unaware that his phone had been pinged in Milwaukee. But when the detectives told him that patrol officers had visited his house around 11:30 in the morning, broke down the door in search of Teri, and found her blood-stained clothes with sticky tape on her legs, David visibly became nervous. He began to fidget in his chair and nervously rubbed his pants with his hands. At that moment, the detective noticed dark stains on his clothing and directly told Larson that there was blood on his jeans, essentially accusing him of lying. David started to waver, and his story suddenly changed. He admitted that Teri had indeed shown up at his house that morning, but he hadn't noticed her immediately. As a good father, Larson was packing the children's homework into their backpacks with his back to the front door. Teri entered silently. When the man turned around, he saw his ex-wife, her face contorted in anger, and she was holding a hammer over her head. The pressure was mounting, and David's lies were becoming increasingly absurd. He then explained to the police that he was shocked by his ex-wife's strange behavior. She had snuck into his house and seemed poised to attack him from behind. Looking into her eyes, he realized she wasn't joking and was determined to strike him with the hammer, so he had to do whatever was necessary to defend himself. Fearing for his life, he grabbed a nearby baseball bat and swung with all his might, hitting Teri in the face. Then David took the tape, but he didn't understand why, and everything that happened afterwards seemed to occur in a fog, and he hardly remembered anything from that morning. Naturally, the detectives didn't believe a single word of Larson's story about self-defense, but they had to listen to him in the hope that he would slip up. They interrogated him for several hours, but he never revealed anything that could help find Teri Jandusa-Nicolai. Eventually, the investigators managed to push David to talk about his children, and he blurted out that he had taken the children to a babysitter. Armed with the information about the girls' whereabouts, the police urgently dispatched a patrol car to the address provided. Following the only lead, the officers cautiously approached the house. They discovered that this time David had told the truth, and both girls were safe at that address. The police were relieved to find the children unharmed. It was a significant breakthrough in the case. However, Holly and Amanda hadn't seen Teri that day. Despite David revealing the children's location, he still didn't say a word about where their mother might be. So the detectives confiscated his personal belongings, such as his wallet and clothes. In the wallet, they found business cards from various organizations and a bunch of receipts. The police began calling all the phone numbers listed, but they had no luck until they stumbled upon a business card that caught their attention. It was for a warehouse storage facility in Wheeling, Illinois. When they called the number listed, the administrator informed them that David Larson had indeed rented a storage unit there. He had been there literally yesterday. Finally, the police believed they knew where to look for the missing woman. By that time, 27 hours had passed since Teri Jandusa's disappearance. The detectives knew they couldn't waste a single second. They raced at full speed, still hoping to find the captive woman alive. Upon reaching the warehouses, with the help of a security guard, they located the correct unit. When the police entered, it was dark and very cold inside. They began calling out Teri's name, hoping she would respond in some way. However, the building remained eerily silent. Using a crowbar, the operatives broke the lock on one of the storage rooms. Various boxes and plastic containers were scattered on the floor, most covered in a layer of dust. As the officers shone their flashlights around, ready to leave, they noticed in the corner behind the shelves a trash bin with its lid taped shut. Next to it lay a two-tone baseball bat, with the handle painted to resemble wood and the tip blackened, with stains resembling dried blood visible on the bat. A chill ran down the detectives' spines. They desperately hoped to find Teri alive. Let's rewind a bit and discover what really happened to the woman after the police car zoomed past with its sirens blaring. The sounds of sirens faded into the distance, and Teri lost her last hope of rescue. At that moment, she could only think about what her ex-husband might have done to the girls. Time seemed to slip away from her. It felt like an eternity had passed since she entered Larson's house that morning. Suddenly, the truck came to a halt, and Teri heard her daughter's voices outside. The girls were somewhere nearby, running around and laughing. Teri's first instinct was to make noise and attract Amanda and Holly's attention, but she quickly pushed that thought away. Firstly, they were so young that they wouldn't be able to do anything, and secondly, she didn't want to traumatize them further. Even on the brink of death, Teri only thought about protecting her children. At that moment, she made a heart-wrenching decision to remain silent. Hearing her daughters laugh and play, Teri realized they hadn't been harmed, and everything was okay with them. If the children found out that their father had attacked their mother, it would only put them at greater risk. David could turn his anger towards them, something that Teri desperately wanted to shield Amanda and Holly from. Then the truck started moving again, and they were off to somewhere else. The next thing Teri felt was the trash bin being dropped to the ground. She had no idea where David had brought her. She only heard something heavy being placed on top from above. Throughout all this time, she remained silent, wanting her ex-husband to believe she was dead and not use any weapons. She was trapped in this icy tomb, wondering what would happen next. Would David try to finish her off, or would he leave her here to die? Teri's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the closing door, after which everything fell silent. She was left completely alone in the sealed plastic container, curled up in a ball. Everyone she loved was left behind, and there was no chance of rescue. Waiting for a few minutes to make sure Larson had left and not set up a trap, Teri began to scream and plead for help as loudly as her hoarse voice and dwindling oxygen allowed. She pressed against the walls of the bin, trying to pry open the top and scratching her legs in the process, managing to lift the lid just enough to get some air. Teri could finally breathe a little easier, but due to her injuries and the low temperature, she quickly lost consciousness. With each passing hour, the situation worsened. Where the trash bin stood, it was cold, and Teri's body was still covered in snow. It no longer melted, because her body temperature was dropping rapidly. Her hands ached, and her feet felt numb from the cold. Teri tried to lower her hands to rub her toes a little, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Her eyelids slowly began to droop. She desperately wanted to rest, telling herself, just for a minute, but immediately snapped out of it and vigorously rubbed her eyes. She knew that falling asleep would be a death sentence. The wound on her head still bled and throbbed terribly. Teri was already so exhausted that eternal sleep seemed like the best way out. Unfortunately, she had lost too much energy to escape from the trash bin, and now she simply lost hope that anyone would find her. She didn't even know where David had left her, but there was one thing that kept her spark alive. If she died, who would protect her children? The fear for her little ones still gave her strength not to give up, and the adrenaline in her blood helped her fight the urge to sleep. Teri would drift in and out of consciousness, sometimes delirious, and then she heard some noise. Her first thought was that David had returned. Panic gripped her mind in an instant. She didn't understand what he was going to do next. Shoot her because she was still alive, or throw the trash bin into the lake. Teri tried to remain calm, not making a sound, hoping he would leave, but the footsteps were getting closer. It had been over a day since Teri Jandusa-Nicolai disappeared. Checking the warehouse belonging to her ex-husband, David Larson, the police noticed a trash bin in the far corner. They removed all the weights from it, cut the tape, and opened the lid. Peering inside, they couldn't believe their eyes at what they saw. Inside, in the fetal position, was a woman. There was a huge wound on her head, swollen eyelids, and a purple face. Her toes were blackened from frostbite, and it looked like she was wearing socks on them. Her appearance was horrifying. Teri had been beaten, tied up, and left to die in the icy trash bin. But miraculously, she was still clinging to life, breathing and able to speak. Detectives who had seen much in their careers were witnessing something like this for the first time. The police feared they would cause even more harm if they tried to extract the woman from the trash bin, so they left her there until the paramedics arrived. It was winter outside, and the day was freezing. Even breathing hurt in the open air, so there was no certainty that the joy wouldn't turn out to be premature. The survivor found in the trash bin could leave this world at any moment. Teri was urgently taken to the hospital. David had beaten her with a baseball bat, and she had spent nearly 27 hours in the snow and ice. Her body temperature was critically low, but she continued to fight for her life. The first thing Teri asked when she came to was where her children were. They explained that the girls were alive and well, and David Larson was in jail. A wave of relief washed over her. Now she knew the fight had been worth it. Teri's husband, Nick, was overwhelmed with joy when the police called him and gave him the news about his wife. The man broke into tears. It was the best phone call he had ever received. Nick rushed to the hospital where his pregnant wife had been taken just a couple of minutes earlier. Despite all the good news, Teri and Nick faced a tragic loss. The child growing in her womb for several weeks was no longer viable because of what she had endured. Teri couldn't keep the baby she had so desperately wanted to tell her daughters about, and their marriage with Nick began in a way they never dreamed of. But Teri did everything possible to focus on the positive aspects. She was still alive, her children were safe, and she was loved and cherished. Even though she had to have her toes amputated due to frostbite, she felt almost relieved. At first, doctors thought that her body's hypothermia would necessitate amputating her legs and arms up to the elbows. However, Teri managed to recover quickly, and they didn't have to resort to such drastic measures. According to the doctor's assessment, she had only 1 hour to live before she would have died, and it was truly miraculous that the police found her in time. Teri spent almost 7 weeks in the hospital, undergoing 10 different surgeries, and even after she returned home, she remained confined to a wheelchair for several more weeks. She was angry that she could no longer run or climb stairs by herself for a while to tuck her girls into bed. But she was grateful that she and her daughters were alive and would never see David again. After a long recovery, Teri had to appear in court to once again face her kidnapper. She relived the emotional trauma, not only from what she had endured while being trapped in the trash bin for over a day, but also from the loss of their unborn child she shared with Nick. Larson's lawyers tried to find evidence that the loss of the unborn child could have occurred naturally, not as a result of her ex-husband's actions. Despite hundreds of undeniable pieces of evidence pointing to David's guilt, the defense wanted to review Teri's medical records for her entire life, and she had to fight again to bring her abuser to justice and put him behind bars. At the federal level, David Larson was sentenced to life in prison. Teri and her family were finally safe. After the verdict was announced, he glared viciously at the woman who, not long ago, was completely under his control. But she knew that her ex-husband would never be able to hurt her or those she loved again. She wouldn't allow anyone to control her life anymore. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.